Welcome back. Now we have turning in place working for both crouching and standing. If we're standing up, we can turn in place. If we're crouching, we can turn in place. But we've noticed that the weapon recoil acts a little funny when we're crouching. In fact, it acts a little funny in a few different circumstances. So in this video, we're going to fix those. Now, the weapon recoil is causing problems in several different circumstances. For one, we saw that when we're crouching, the recoil is very dramatic. So that's not good. We're going to want to turn that down. Also, when we're turning in place, it looks horrible. We actually don't want that recoil at all when we're turning in place. Now, if we're standing up, this is actually a problem as well. So you can see a little bit of jerkiness when turning in place. So we're going to actually reduce this recoil down to 0 when turning in place. Now, if we're crouching and we're reloading, we do want to be able to see that reload animation. So this layered blend per bone here in the section where we're blending between locomotion and weapon fire, it has this slot reload. Now, we'll never be firing our weapon when we're reloading. So if we're reloading, this blend value can be 1. But if we're not reloading and we're firing, well, then we need to see if we're turning in place. And also we need to see if we're crouching. If we're crouching, we need to reduce the value. If we're standing, we want to increase the value. And also when we're standing, you'll notice that the recoil is much more dramatic when it's hip firing versus when we're aiming. So we can actually turn that value up when we're aiming to get a bit more recoil, and down when we're not aiming to get a bit less recoil. So let's go ahead and create a variable that we can use for this blend weights value. So we'll go back into our C++ shooter anim instance.h and we'll create a float called weapon recoil weight. So let's go ahead and add a private float and call this weapon recoil weight. And you know what? Actually, I'm just going to call it recoil weight just to make it a little bit less of a burdensome name to type. And I'm going to use this U property that was used for B crouching. And instead of category crouching, I'll give it the category of combat. Okay, and let's give this a comment. We'll say change the recoil weight based on turning in place and aiming. Okay, so in shooter anim instance.cpp, we'll go up to the top and give this a default value. And so this is recoil weight. We'll give this a default value of 1.f. Okay, so that gives us a float for the recoil weight. Now I also want a Boolean that will tell me whether or not we're turning in place. So I'm going to create another Boolean, bool, and I'm going to call it b turning in place. I'll give it the same properties, and I'll give this a comment, and it'll simply say true when turning in place. And I'll give this a default value as well, and by default it'll be false. Now, when is this going to be true? Well, if we scroll all the way down, we have a function called turn in place. And if we scroll all the way down here, we'll see that we have this const float turning, and that's a curve value. That'll be 1 if we're playing a turning animation and 0 if we're not. So here in the if check to see if it's greater than 0, this means we're turning in place. So we can set our bool be turning in place equal to true right here. And then after this if check, we can place an else and say b turning in place is false. So turning in place is basically dependent on this turning value. Okay, so after we have turning in place, right here at the bottom, now we can set the value for our recoil weight. So the first thing I'm going to check is if we're turning in place. So if b turning in place, if that's the case, then we want the recoil weight to be 0. So recoil weight equals 0.f. But else, then we can check some other conditions. First of all, I want to see if we're crouching. So we're going to say if be crouching. Now, if we're in this else statement here, then we're not turning in place. So this is crouching and idling. We're not turning. If we're crouching and idling, I want to know if we're reloading. And if we are, then recoil weight can be 1. And that's because if we look at our layered blend per bone, this recoil weight that we're using has this reload slot here. And if it's 1, we're not going to be firing our weapon anyway. We're just going to be reloading. So if that's the case, we can have it be a value of 1. So we're going to say if be reloading, then recoil weight equals 1.f. And in fact, if we're turning in place, we want this to be 1 if we're reloading in that case as well. So why don't we go up to here where we're turning in place and say if be reloading, recoil weight is 1, else recoil weight is 0. So we'll put it like that. So that way if we're turning in place and we're reloading, we're not shooting, so recoil weight can be 1. Otherwise, if we're not reloading, we want it to be 0, so we will not get that wonky behavior. Now, in the else case, we're not turning in place. I'm going to go ahead and put a comment to remind me. Now, we're not turning in place, so if we're reloading, recoil weight can be 1. Otherwise, recoil weight should be really low, something like 0.1. So we're going to make it 0.1f. And we can tweak this, of course. Now, if we're not turning in place and we're not crouching, in other words, in the else case here, then we should check to see if we're aiming. So let's see if be aiming. And if we are aiming, we can set our recoil weight to a higher value. So we'll make it 1. And if we're not aiming, in other words, in the else case, we should set the recoil weight a little bit lower so it's not so dramatic from the hip. Let's put it at about 0.5, 0.5f. Okay, so just to recap, if we're turning in place and we're reloading, recoil weight can be 1. Otherwise, we don't want to be able to have any recoil while we're turning in place, because then we could be firing the weapon and we'd get some strange behavior, some jerkiness. Now, if we're not turning in place, we're just standing there, we want to see if we're crouching. If we're crouching and reloading, recoil weight can be 1 because we're not going to be shooting the weapon. However, if we're not reloading, we want it to be very, very low, like 0.1. Now, if we're not crouching and we're not turning in place, then we're just standing there. And if we're aiming, recoil weight should be 1. But if we're not aiming, it should be lower, like 0.5. Okay, let's go ahead and compile this. Okay, we're back here in the editor. I'm going to right-click and type recoil weight and get recoil weight. And I'm going to plug that in here for the blend weights value of our layered blend per bone here in our blend between locomotion and weapon fire. And I'm going to compile, save, and hit play. Now there are several cases that we need to check here. For one, we're going to see when we're not turning in place and we're not aiming, how does it look? So there's a moderate level of recoil. Now if we're aiming, it looks about the same. So that's actually a bit more consistency that we didn't have before. So that's great. Now let's turn in place while we're firing. Well, we just happened to reload right there. Let's try again when we don't need to reload. Okay, so we were turning in place and still getting weapon fire. So we need to check our logic again. So if turning in place and reloading, recoil weight was 1, else recoil weight should have been 0. Okay, I'm taking a look at my code here, and you probably realized this as soon as I typed it, but when turning is greater than 0, turning in place should be true. I guess I put false, but that should definitely be true. So I'm going to have to recompile this, and we'll test this again. So if you caught that, great job. You have a great eye, and you're paying attention. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this and try this again. Okay, so we've compiled. Let's go ahead and test this again. Okay, so when not aiming and aiming, we have relatively the same recoil. That's good. I'm going to reload. Now I'm going to fire as I turn. Excellent. So we have our recoil when we're not turning, and as soon as we start turning, we're no longer getting any recoil. Perfect. So we don't have any jerky motion. Excellent. Now let's go ahead and try crouching. And we'll see that now our recoil is a lot less dramatic, so that looks excellent. Now let's try turning in place. Excellent. That looks really good. And now we can try reloading while turning in place. And let's see, I think I've run out of ammo, so I'm going to have to start over. And I'll crouch, I'll shoot, and I'll reload and turn in place. And we are still able to turn and reload. Everything is looking great. Now we can't fire while we're reloading, so there's nothing to worry about there. And of course I can try reloading and turning in place while standing, and that works as well. Now we're ready to continue with the series. So we now have our recoil acting a little bit more realistically. Perfect. Now, one last thing you may have noticed is if I go ahead and reload while I'm standing still, you'll see that the reload animation barely happens. That's because while we're standing still, we set our recoil weight to 0.5. But if we're reloading, we want that to be 1 as well. So let's go back and fix this. Here we have our set the recoil weight code. If we're not turning in place, that's this else statement here, we check to see if we're crouching. But if we're not crouching, then we see if we're aiming. If we're aiming, we set recoil weight to 1. Otherwise, it's 0.5. So this means if we're reloading, we set it to 0.5, but we want it to be 1 if we're reloading. So this if statement can simply be changed to include an or, and we can say if we are reloading as well, then recoil weight can also be 1. Let's go ahead and compile this. Okay, so now we're back in the editor. I'm going to fire a round, and I'm going to reload, and reloading works as expected. Okay, this will conclude this video. In the next video, we're going to work on moving while we're crouching, so we can actually walk around in a crouched state. See you then.